Hi there, welcome to After the Last Page. My name is Jackie and I'm your resident writing coach. Today we're talking about what to do after you've developed your story idea. So finding something to write about can be a little bit tricky. I often encourage writers to pick the idea that you think about the most. So when I was writing my first book, I thought a lot about this particular story that I had grown up on, and I wanted to do kind of a retelling of this story in a way that was new and different and unique. So you can do something like that. Or another thing that I really encourage writers to do is to pick up books that are kind of like this. This is a cute little book of writing prompts, and you can find books like these just about anywhere. Sometimes our local libraries have them. You can find writing prompts like this online. You can even often find books like this on Amazon. So this one is really quirky, and it has both nonfiction and fiction prompts in it. So this one, here's an example. It says, convey the third sound in detail. Oh, this is a second part of another one. So you're launching a sound recording of life on Earth into outer space to act as an emissary for the human race. And then you're going to name the specific sounds that you will record. So at the end of these sounds, then you have another writing prompt. So that one's a little bit more complicated. But this one is a nonfiction prompt, and this one is describe the most gruesome thing you've ever seen or experienced. So some of the things in here are kind of really strange. There's some really interesting prompts in here. One of these is to fill in like missing letters. There's a lot of sci-fi prompts in here now that I'm looking at it. Here's another one. What is at the top of your list of things you want to do before you die? So there are lots of cool different prompts in a book like this. There's a lot of different books like these on the internet, but you can find this particular one at chroniclebooks.com. So now let's talk a little bit about what to do once we have an idea for our book. Now this is where things get a little bit hairy. Most of us as writers get very excited about our characters. I know I certainly do. And the first thing that we want to do is go into thinking about what our characters look like and what they think like and what their jobs might be and when they were born and, you know, coming up with all these different ideas. And so what we might do as first-time writers is go to Google and search the web and find a character map, which is a great thing to do. Typically, these will have you fill in what color your character's eyes are, or what their hair looks like, or what kind of clothes they wear, what kind of music they listen to. And while these are all very good things to know, and this is a valid exercise, it really is, it's not the thing that I tell writers to do first. So while having characters is important and having a dynamic character is super important to our story, I think the most important element of a story, the thing that drives it forward, isn't knowing what color our character's hair is, right? It's not knowing what kind of music they listen to. The most important thing that drives their story forward is what? Conflict. So in order to keep our story going, we need something interesting going on. We need a plot. So a plot is kind of tricky to plan when you haven't written the story yet. So it's really important to kind of think about these things before we go into writing. Now, some writers, there's typically two types of writers. There's the type of writer that flies by the seat of their pants, and then there's the writer that's the planner. And every now and then you get a writer that's in between. But most often, it's one or the other. So sometimes you can kind of identify which one of these you might be just based on your patterns with other things in life. But more often than not, you'll figure it out pretty quickly which one you are. But planning can really do a lot of wonderful things for us, even if you're a pantser. And let me explain why. So, planning can help keep our plotline on track and can kind of move the story forward when we get stuck. And getting stuck is just a part of writing a book. It happens to all of us, it happens to even the most seasoned writers. You might be the coolest 100-year-old cast iron pan, and you still will not be seasoned enough that you don't get writer's block. It's true. It's true. And what writer's block really comes down to is not having ideas. It's not, you know, it's not knowing what to put on the page. It's more of just sitting there and being stuck in your own thought process. It's kind of difficult to describe, actually. But it's more of just being like so frenzied up in your brain that you can't put two and two together. So a great way to combat this is putting together some kind of plot planning. My favorite way to plan for my plots is to create a table of contents. Now, if you've never heard of a table of contents, they're often in the very beginning of like anthologies. We don't see them as often in books anymore as we used to. A lot of times we used to see them in like children's books or fairy tales, and we just don't see them all that often anymore unless it's a textbook. But contents can be really useful to us, and this is not something that needs to be in your final draft. It's something that is just for you. And the reason that I love this technique, and it is wholeheartedly one of my favorite techniques, is because what we can do with this is we can line out chapter by chapter and tell ourselves later on down the road, 3, 6 months, however long it takes you to write your book, 2 years even, we can sit down and say, okay, well, in chapter 26, I want my character to discover that her best friend has a pair of red heels in the closet. And these red heels were stolen. So the stolen red heels are in the closet, right? And that might be our, I don't know, our climax, I guess, right? So it might drive us towards the end of the story for whatever reason. But, you know, these little details we might forget over time. So the nice thing is that this table of contents can really help us to remember some of these details and keep them fresh in our mind as we're writing things down. It can also be a great way to keep track of some character traits, such as last names or the names of, you know, a character that wrote a book. Like my specific book that I'm writing right now, there's a few books that are referenced in my book that are written by specific authors that don't exist, and trying to keep track of the names of those characters is sometimes challenging. So keeping track of that on a specific piece of paper, like a table of contents, is really nice to do. So that is a really nice option. Typically what I do is I'll write a sentence or two for each chapter. And I don't often write more than that because I find that the plot changes as I write, and that's perfectly okay. It's very rare for a writer to go through the whole story and not have anything change as you're writing. It's pretty typical. So it's totally okay if things change as you go. So with that being said, another option that you can do, if you're not as much of a write it out kind of guy or gal, you can do a plot map, which is more visual. And this kind of looks like a roller coaster, you know, like the hill on a roller coaster. So you go up and then down. And you might have seen these previously. We use them a lot in school, you know, particularly in like middle school or high school. So you might have already used one, and we call these plot arcs. So a plot arc has, well, any plot really typically has 3 acts. So just like a play, you're going to have 3 different stages to your plot. So you have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Your Act 1 is going to include your inciting incident. It's going to kind of prompt the conflict forward, but it's not going to quite be the conflict yet. And Act 1 is typically like 50 pages. So on the hill, right? So if this is our hill, our Act 1 is going to be going up the hill. So then into Act 2, that would be our actual hill. Correct. So once we get to the hill, that's going to be about 100 pages, give or take, supposing that we have a 200-page book. We want half of that book to be Act 2, and then half of that book to be Act 1 and 3. So a majority of our story is going to be this middle chunk. That's our meat of our story, right? And that's kind of like the body of your essay, So if you can hear my panting dog in the background, I apologize. So we're going to continue to just kind of focus on having that meaty bit in the middle of our story. And that's what's going to propel us into Act 3, which is when we're going down the hill. Our roller coaster is going down, 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 and that's where our conclusion is, down at the bottom. So at the end of Act 3, that's when we're kind of going to have this climax, and that kind of pushes us like forward. So if we're thinking about this in plot terms, right? Let's use a book as an example. So a really popular book right now is Fourth Wing. Let's use that one. So if we're looking at Fourth Wing, right? So our setup is in Act 1. So at the very beginning of Fourth Wing, we learn that our main character is a young girl named Violet, and she's 20, I think. And she... my dog. And so Violet is supposed to be a scribe in her other life, except we learn that her mother wants her to be a dragon rider like the rest of the family. Now her dad was a scribe, but her dad has passed, so she has kind of come to the conclusion that she has to follow her mother's word, and that is final. So she's going to become a dragon rider, and she has no other choice, and that is our setup. Now our inciting incident is kind of this conflict that's happening that we don't really know how this is going to affect the character yet, but we know that it's really important to the story. So in Fourth Wing, this is kind of both Violet's grief of losing her brother, who was also a dragon rider, and also the fact that Violet has some physical complications that keep her from being, the strongest rider in her group. So she's not sure if she's gonna make it out alive, because you either become a rider or you die. So this is kind of her inciting incident, right? So, and then we have our first plot point. So here, this is going up our hill, right? So then once we get to Act 2, then we get into conflict. You know how that's how we want to go. So if you're looking at this on a piece of paper, right, you want to create on your paper your curve, and then put in little dots for each plot point that you want to highlight. And you can make this as messy as you want to make it. The messier, the better. And just put little lines from each dot where you think your plot points might be. And just write down things that you think you want to happen. And this works with any genre. You can do this with nonfiction, with fiction, but I do think it works best with fiction in general, because nonfiction doesn't always necessarily follow this plot arc. And that being said, the plot arc is not something that is inflexible. So you can kind of move things around as you please. Your roller coaster does not have to be the same between books. Not all roller coasters are the same. Some roller coasters are larger, some roller coasters are smaller, some roller coasters are baby coasters. So, not all plot arcs are going to be the same. You might not even find that a plot arc helps you. If your story is more character driven, you're going to be looking at a lot of internal conflict versus external conflict. So, how are those conflicts going to play into your plot? These are all important questions to be asking yourself as you're kind of plotting to move forward. But that being said, however you plan your plot, plotting is important because this is what drives your readers to continue reading. Because the last thing that you want is a book that readers DNF. And usually, readers will DNF your book within the first 50 pages. So if you do not have something that is pulling readers forward to find out more, that inciting incident and that first plot point are going to be so important to keep your story moving forward. So what happens after we've developed a plot? Well, that is a great question. So getting words on the page is really tricky. And I find that sometimes after plotting, it's best to just open up a Word document and go for it. When I was writing my first book, I found that I kind of just wanted to sit there and think about like point of view and what scenes were really important, and what opening line would sound the best. But none of that really is relevant. I didn't even have a title of my book until I finished the book. So none of those things really matter when you're writing. The most important thing is getting the story on the page. You just need something on the page. You can have a 200,000 word first draft that absolutely sucks. And it's okay, because you know what? That is what editing is for. So the fantastic thing about all of this is that you can go back and you can go back in 3 months later and edit out all of the reallys and veries and filler words that you might have added in. You'll find out, especially in the first draft, that you probably use a lot of tense changes. You might struggle to find your point of view. I certainly did when I was writing. But I think the most important thing is really to find a routine and make sure that you're writing in that routine, in that schedule. Something that I really like to do, and I encourage writers to do, is to set a timer every day. They call this writing sprints, but you can call it whatever you want, really. And I usually set it for like 45 minutes or an hour, and I try to write at least 1,000 words a day if I can. It's really not that much. 1,000 words is maybe a page when you think about it. Like, it's really not a lot. Even, maybe a page and a half with dialogue. So, I think it's really important to be consistent, and that can really drive your writing forward and make things easier for you as you start your first draft. So that's one of the biggest tips that I would recommend, is to be consistent. Don't go back and edit. You're probably going to have a lot of tense changes in the beginning, and you might have a lot of point of view changes, and that's fine. I really was not super worried about that by the time I got into my second draft, because there were so many other things that needed to be changed. I figured out what my groove was by a few weeks in. So, and I think most writers do really figure that out pretty early on. And if you don't, that's okay. It's something that can be fixed during editing. So I do recommend just skip the editing part, because if you don't skip editing and you just go back in and edit every time that you write, you'll never move yourself forward. So it's important to just keep moving forward, keep writing, keep those scheduled times, and make sure that you're writing as much as you can. I know life does get busy. Many of us have other jobs and other responsibilities, but it is really paramount to be able to pick a time every day to just devote to your craft. So those are my tips for what to do once you have an actual idea to move ahead with your book. If you go ahead and hit that subscribe button below, you'll be notified from my videos for next week. So thanks again for joining, and let me know in the comments below if any of these tips helped you. Bye!